What's up, everybody? Welcome back to grade school. I'm super pumped to be back with you guys. It's been, I think, the longest interval that we've had since grade school started, and I've really missed hanging out with you guys. So I'm glad to be back with everybody this morning. And we're going to start off this morning by talking about, I'm going to start off today really by talking about curves. That's what I want to spend all of our session on today. And you guys may have some idea already of what I mean when I say curves. You might know what I'm referring to or get some images in your mind when I talk about curves. But before we even get into questions, I just want to expand all of our horizons a little bit in terms of how we define and how we think about curves. So let's start by going to probably what we all initially think of when we talk about curves, which is to look at our custom curves right here. Our custom curves are a really handy way. Let me set up some kind of color management here on my image, like so. And as many of us may already know, our custom curves are a really handy way of manipulating the journey from pure black to pure white. And you guys have heard me talk a lot lately, in particular in my most recent video about kind of ditching the video look. You guys have heard me talk about how a big part of leveling up our game when we're color grading is to think not only about pure black and pure white, but about the entirety of the journey in between those two poles, because that's really where the majority of our image lives. It's perfectly smart to think about, like, okay, what's pure black, what's pure white, but we want to pay equal, probably more attention to what that ride that we're giving the pixels in between looks like. So the custom curves can be a really handy way of kind of making that manipulation in a tactile way. And that's stuff that you guys have seen me talk about before in prior videos and certainly in prior grade schools as well. So I can create, like if we're starting with the most kind of garden variety, like common concepts of curves, something like we just drew here in our custom curves would be a great example of that. We're just manipulating the tonal curve of our image. And as you guys have seen me cover many times as well, I can also, in addition to manipulating all three of my channels kind of in tandem, I can break out and say, hey, I want the blue to reach a little bit. I'll do this in a new node actually and say, I want the blue to reach a little bit higher than, let's see if I can remember how to use resolve. Let's start with that. And we can say,
okay, we're not seeing your screen.
Oh. I don't know if any of you guys were with me on Saturday. I know some of you were for Learn with Masters, but I was glad to hear that even my hero, Walter, regularly makes this dumb error of forgetting to share the screen. So just to rewind just a hair, what I was just doing when I was talking and thinking everyone was seeing what I was doing is drawing this curve right down here. Just a standard custom curve of doing like a loom versus loom, where we're changing the journey from where pure black is, what we're doing in between, and where we're dyeing up at the top. And what I was beginning to do beyond that is say, oh, okay, well, in addition to manipulating our red, green, and blue curves kind of in tandem, we can manipulate each channel individually. So I might pump some extra blue into the shadows and maybe a little bit of extra green to go along with it. And then I might do some kind of warm cocktail in the top. I'm doing option clicks here on my custom curves to stay pinned to my unity line, and then I'm doing little rainbows kind of up above. So we could do something like this. All stuff we've talked about and you guys have seen me do before, but this is kind of like the baseline of what I mean when I'm talking about curves and what most of us probably think of when we talk about curves. But if we go further than this, the interesting thing, the best way to understand curves is by zooming out a little bit and thinking about actually a conversation I was just having with Gadali about we have color spaces and we have tone curves, and hopefully at least some of you guys have started to get a little more comfortable with what that stuff means and how it affects our workflows. There's like another layer to the image science that sort of backbones our journey from what the sensor sees to what our eyes see on the final display device, and that is the color model side of things. So we normally take for granted that we are working in an RGB color model, meaning that we have three separate channels and that we are specifying any particular color or any complex arrangement of colors like we have in an image like this with a triplet of red, green, and blue values and saying, okay, I can specify any color that I wish with such a triplet. So a simple example, 1, 0, 0. That would be an RGB triplet that would yield pure red because I'm saying 1 for my red channel, 0 for my green channel, and 0 for my blue channel. So that's kind of the RGB color model, and we use it so commonly and like so thoroughly that we almost take it as we kind of take it for granted, and we don't even consider the fact that that's only one of many potential ways that we can specify a specific color. We can do that with a number of 3-channel systems, and the most common sort of class of models beyond the traditional RGB color model would be the cylindrical color models, which you guys may be familiar with, but maybe don't exactly know how they configure into a color grading environment. Those would be cylindrical models such as HSV or HSL. Those are probably the most common ones. And we're not going to talk about HSV and HSL in much depth right now, but the reason I bring this whole conversation up about color models and about in relation to curves is because when we are working in different color models, now in addition to stuff like we were just looking at where we're saying, okay, we can in a nonlinear way manipulate the response of our red, our green, and our blue channel. That's cool. But when we are moving in between and looking at different color models, like let's just do a simple experiment here. Let's go over to something fresh for fun. And let's do a color space transform. And I'm going to just quickly transform us from my Log C working space into, let's call it an HSV. And we'll stay in Log C. I'm just going to change that color model. And I'm going to kind of flip some of these things off. And then I'm going to create a second transform that's going to take me back out of there. And you guys don't need to follow everything that I'm doing or be able to do this yourself. But the reason I make this little kind of sandwich right here that I'm now going to work inside of is these same custom curves that are delineating, okay, where's pure 0, where's 1, and what happens in between. These have a completely different context, and you're going to be a little overwhelmed by how differently these tools are going to behave when I start messing with them right now. So because we are no longer in a RGB color model where 1, 2, and 3 are red, green, and blue, we're in an HSV color model where 1, 2, and 3 are hue, saturation, and value, which is somewhat equivalent to like brightness or luminance. Now, if I mess with my red channel, it's going to look nuts because I'm messing with the hue of my entire image. And you can actually see things if I move my scope out from behind my face. You can see the rotation of my hue on the vector scope just as I move my red channel. And same thing if I were to go to my green, you would see a change instead of in the greenness, you would see a change in the colorfulness of my image because I'm in a different model now. And same thing on my blue, you would see a change not in the blueness, but in the overall brightness or darkness of my image. So that's one example of the same concept that can be applied in a radically different way depending on the color model that we're working in. And there's all kinds of other fun applications of curves and conversations to be had around curves. Obviously, when we talk about tone curves, those are a great example of curves. And you guys have seen me demo out. If I kind of come back to solid earth and talk about a little bit more basic stuff for a moment, if I go to my LUTs here and I'm going to grab a grayscale ramp and do a demo that I did in, I believe, part 1 of the Create Better Contrast series, you guys can see if I go to a ramp, turn off my output transform, and do some curves manipulation here, we can visualize the way my curves are manipulating my image. And we can also get a visualization for if I were to do, as an example, a color space transform from Alexa log C to Alexa linear. That is a curve being applied. That is when I tell this color space transform I want to change tone curves. Not surprisingly, we are making a curve adjustment that just happens to be driven by like very specific math as opposed to a freehand operation here on the curves, but it's the same basic mechanism. So this is a bunch of different kind of examples of a concept I want to spend most of today talking about, which is the idea of curves as something that allow us to substantially and significantly alter the character of our image or the state of our image without bending or breaking or creating artifacts or banding or many of the things that can accompany adjustments that we want to make to our image. So I hope that's enough to kind of like initially get your gears turning and start thinking about like, okay, what are some questions and ideas that I might want to explore today or regarding curves, regarding modulating our image or modifying our image using curves in any of the ways that it's described or in any other way that involves bending rather than moving the image in a straight line. So bunch of crazy thoughts for you guys. If you don't follow all that stuff, totally cool. I absolutely just want to stimulate your imagination with that kind of opening set of arguments, and hopefully that gives you some ideas for stuff you want to talk about. How are we looking out there, Gedalia? Any interesting questions popping up yet?
It's a little quiet today, but I've got one to get us started.
Cool.
Why would someone choose curves over another tool? What does it allow us to do that in the workflow lift gamma gain does not, or is there a different place for it in the workflow, like for corrections versus setting a look?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So like, let's look at the most basic answer to that question. And let's just say let's do something that out in the wild I wouldn't really do, but let's just say we are going to forego color management for a moment. Let's just say like this raw, untouched version of my image. Let's like flip over to something fresh just to keep things interesting. Let's look at this image here, or we'll go to our sunset maybe. And let's say we're hanging out with Cullen when he began his career, and he doesn't know from color management, he doesn't know from curves, and he just wants to make this image look better than it does. Like get it to a normalized level of contrast and saturation. If we don't have curves, if we are only going to use linear traditional color correction tools such as lift gamma gain, let's see where we can get. Let's drop our lift down and let's stretch our gain upwards like so. And bring things down like this. You can see, like, despite the fact that my computer seems to be sluggish this morning, like there's a way to use these tools to get an acceptable visual result. But this is something I actually talked about last weekend and Learn with Masters for any of you guys who were there. We're not quite getting the full story here when we just look at our image, because we are exploding out the extreme ends of our image in a way that already, with this fairly like conservative set of adjustments that I'm making, I'm already beginning to get like clipping at the upper and lower ends of my signal. Like there are shadow details and highlight details that are just being completely nuked. And here's the challenge, and this is what I discovered the hard way without even having like the language or the concepts to understand why, is I discovered the hard way that when I'm making linear operations like lift or gain, gamma is not quite a linear operation, so I'll maybe leave that aside for now. But when I'm making really linear operations like lift or gain, there's no way for me to avoid what I just talked about, except to avoid introducing an acceptable level of contrast altogether. I'm either going to get an overall kind of weight of, I'm going to get an overall sort of proper level of weight on the bottom of my image, to just talk about the shadows for a minute, or I'm not. And if I'm going to get that proper weight using lift, I'm probably going to end up having to clip stuff out. So perfect example of what we can do with curves. And this is, like related to some of the things that I talked about in that Ditch the Video look video that I did recently. If I want to get this same feeling of weight and sort of normalization in the bottom end, this might be a great candidate for using curves. And in fact, this is what color management does. It relies heavily on curves to get that same feeling, but by employing non-linear behavior. So I might get a similar result by grabbing, just to sort of recap for you guys, let me turn my scope off for a second here. Maybe that's what's making me drag. If I wanted to one-to-one recreate the lift that I was just doing, I could do that by grabbing this bottom point and moving it over to my right. Like that is literally a lift operation. It's the exact same manipulation. If I wanted to get that same feeling of driving the darker portion of the image even darker, I could do that instead of with a linear operation like you see here. I'm literally in the parlance of like mathematics, I am increasing the slope of this line. If I wanted to get a nonlinear behavior that's going to allow me to hold shadows but also have deep shadows, I could grab and I could create a knee or a toe, which you guys have seen me talk about before and do before, and that's why I do it. That's generally why I preserve custom curves and curves in general to straight lines, because we don't perceive things linearly, and by the time we drive like the mass of our darker portion of the image down to where it belongs, if we're not sort of tapering that adjustment off so that it's having a little bit less of an impact by the time I reach zero, we end up with these corrections where we're having to make these really frustrating compromises where it's like, okay, great, I got all this contrast and now I don't have any detail. And I'll give you guys some homework for those of you who are interested. Textbook example of this. You can look at a lot actually of the sort of first generation of digital intermediates, but textbook example. I'll preface this by saying I'm such a fan of Steven Soderbergh. I love Steven Soderbergh. He's one of my favorite filmmakers. But if you look at what he did in Traffic, it's painfully evident in Traffic that they had a color corrector at their disposal for the first time ever. And unlike the prior century where they just had color timing, they suddenly had contrast. Like, oh, I can directly influence the contrast of my image. However, they only had linear contrast, like we were just playing around with, of like the lift and gain variety. So if you look at Traffic, Traffic is trying like crazy to get this super, super slammed contrast look, and it does, but it comes at the expense of all tonal detail. There is no life in the bottom of those images and no life in the top. The entire like tonal variety of any of those images, if it's there at all, exists in the middle. So you guys could look to Traffic as like a perfect example of the consequences that we don't need to pay of working in straight lines instead of working with curves.
All right, got a question from Depender related here about beginners are given the advice of keep as much details in the shadows and highlights, and I feel that this advice is great a lot of the time, but limits my ability to create better luma contrast by losing details. So I guess the question here is, what is the balance between contrast and keeping details?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And in fact, as you said, Gadali, that does piggyback really nicely off of what we are talking about, because there's so much non-linearity that has to happen between exposing an image to a camera sensor and ultimately reproducing that image for our eyes to see. In addition to, you guys have heard me talk so much about like just navigating like the technical side of that, of like, well, a camera sensor is probably going to natively have a linear response, meaning that if I double the amount of light, it's going to see double the amount of light. Compare that to the way my eyes work. If I cut the amount of light or double the amount of light in this room right now, I will not perceive a 200% increase. I'll perceive somewhat less because my eyes actually don't work on, all of our eyes, I don't have bionic eyes, none of our eyes work on a linear tone curve, they work on a log tone curve. So there's all these accommodations that we have to make just for the fact of like, how do cameras see, how do displays reproduce, and how do eyes see? And there's all these sort of accommodations that we have to make just to net out a perceptually linear image at the end of the chain. So that's kind of one conversation we've had more of, but this is another layer. Excuse me 1 second, guys. I've got a couple of mad hound dogs down below. Yeah, okay. No imminent threat on my life. The burglars aren't here to kill me after all. So in addition to that sort of like objective set of tasks of like, all right, we got to figure out how to get from the very bottom to we got to figure out how to get from capture to reproduction in a reliable way. There's also this question of like, well, what do our eyes like to see and what makes for palatable images? And that's much more slippery. There's much less like fixed math that we can use in those things. So that's where this question comes in. And that's even where, concepts like this introduction of rolling contrast become a matter of taste. Like, I'm going to turn my color management back on here. And if we look at, let me just draw a, preferential contrast curve that I like on this image, or maybe on a brand new one, you know, if we draw that like so, it's very much up to me as to whether or not I want to work in curves or I want to work in straight lines, and determine sort of like, how do I want to contour or like express my image. So I would say, to go back to the original question, the trade-off of how do I address the fact that I want to preserve tonal detail generally, but I also want to create images that like have snap and have the proper amount of contrast. It's absolutely a feel thing. And ultimately, even in an operation, what I was going to say a moment ago, is even in an operation like an S-curve, this is a very good and very handy sort of universal perceptual attempt at preserving tonal detail. It's a better alternative to working in straight lines, like I just said. But even here, technically, we are removing some of the variation between tones. Like if you look at any tone that any set of tones that fall into this section of the curve, there's less contrast here than they initially had. And there's no way around that. And it's actually good to recognize that explicitly and say, okay, just by using a curve, for example, to create my contrast, that's not mitigating the fact that I have to be judicious about how I want to reproduce my contrast, what my aesthetic preference is. And even though this looks better and generally is better than doing straight lines, I'm still reducing contrast just in a bit more of a targeted way than across the entirety of the image. Or I'm losing tonal detail, I should say, in this area and in this area, but less so than if I were to simply do a move like that, for example. So no matter what, we are compressing and condensing tonal variation, tonal detail, overall contrast. We're like contouring and sculpting that stuff down to something smaller and simpler than it was out there in the wild, would be the simplest way to put that. And that's our job as artists, is to figure out, how do we want to do that? What are the ways that generally don't work and result in unpleasant viewer experience? And what are the ways that just seem like reliably to work, even though we are still performing that same task, just in a different way? Long answer, hopefully helpful.
All right. Rafa is wondering, on Saturday, Walter and other colorists mentioned that they don't really use or enjoy using curves. Can you elaborate on why, since you seem to use them a lot?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I even mentioned in my portion of the evening that I struggle with curves as well, even though the concept of it, I have, as I have shared with you guys this morning, I have great affection for, and I understand from having dabbled in it enough that like curves underlie almost everything that we do in, like the sort of like under the hood of good color grading and good image science. But in terms of like the custom curves as a tool, some of what I haven't liked in the past is that they were kind of confined to this little window here. After it was like Resolve 14, I think, was the last time they had the so-called big curves. But in Resolve 17, the big curves are now back. So that officially puts to rest one of my biggest beefs, which is like just wanting a bigger canvas so that I can see what I'm doing more and begin to make more sort of fine-toothed adjustments to the image. So that's kind of like one mitigating factor for me that has made the curves a bit easier, because I feel like I can like work with them a little more handily and in a little more detail now than when we were confined to that little tiny palette down below. So that's kind of point number one. But the other main reason, the other main like answer to that question that I would give is that the curves don't represent for me the ideal combination of control and constraint. And we can think of pretty much any tool that we're going to use in Resolve as an exercise in control versus constraint, because there are certain things that we want to offer the user very, very detailed and explicit control over. And there are certain things that we want to offer some basic constraint against. For example, these custom curves work in a range of, this bottom point right here represents a pixel value, an RGB triplet value, to go back to that conversation, of 0, 0, 0. And this point up here represents an RGB triplet value of 1, 1, 1. And the fact that the curves have been set up to span that range and not a smaller range, say from 0 to 0.5, or a larger range, say from 0 to 20 or something like that, that's an example of a useful constraint. Because if the curves tool were designed that way, I would have this massive canvas, 80% of which I would have no utility for whatsoever, because there is no image that lives in those values when we're working in the spaces that we generally do in Resolve. So that's one example of many that I could give of like constraint as a positive thing. We don't tend to think of constraint as a positive thing. We're like, no, I want all the control, but you don't want all the control. You want control over the right variables, and then you want the sensible application of constraint over some others so that you're not completely lost in the woods in terms of like being able to quickly make the adjustments that you wish to make. So to go back to the custom curves, one of the sort of constraints that I struggle with is one that I talked about on Saturday and a couple people talked about, which is that there's no way on the curves for me to directly evaluate. Like, I would love to see a sort of crosshair on my curve graph of, okay, here's where your incoming middle gray is hitting, and then to see where I am moving, if anywhere, that middle gray on the output. That's a constraint that I would like to at least have the option to impose on my grading, because depending on what I'm doing, like if I'm doing custom curves on a specific shot, like it's fair play. I don't care about preserving middle gray. I'm just going by feel at that point, because I've already built up an entire pipeline that's preserving middle gray. So if my contrast adjustment moves me off of there, and that's what my eyes dictate, that must be creatively where I want my contrast adjustment to go. But if I'm creating like a global contrast curve, as you guys have heard me talk so much about, like a look, I really don't want that look to move middle gray. I really want it to hold it where it is, especially if I'm, for example, designing a look that is actually going to get rolled into a LUT that's going to go back out to production. And if I move middle gray half a stop down, that means that the production team is going to be overlighting everything by half a stop from that point forward. So in those situations, it's extra important to preserve middle gray. And that's why in the custom curves, that's one of a few constraints that I wish were imposed a bit more rigidly, or at least offered as options. And we kind of already talked about the other side of that, which is the control side. I feel like the exploded view here, the big curves, gives me a bit more control than I had before. But it's for me, the challenges of the curves graph are a combination of those two factors of like in some areas wanting a bit more control and in some other areas wanting a bit more constraint.
Jim says he keeps hearing about the breaking of curves. He tends to be able to see that happening when the footage is monochrome, and asks, do you ever check your luminance curves without color information? Any downfalls of doing that or not doing that?
I don't think there's any downfalls to that. No, that's not typically something that I do, simply because like let's come up with let's do a simple example of a breaking of a curve. I'm trying to think of the fastest possible way to do this. Okay, this will take just a second, but I think this is a worthy exercise. Let's all do something real quick here. Let's say for a moment, I'm going to give you guys like a really fast sort of tutorial on LUT creation, which leads me to another tangent very, very quickly. We just announced this morning with Color Intelligence that I'm going to be doing a course all about show LUT creation. It's going to be a 2-week course. We're going to be working together through a combination of pre-recorded, but also some live sessions where I'm going to be looking at what you're doing and giving you feedback. So head over to Color Intelligence. I'll leave a link here in the video after we wrap up today for signing up for that course, but we're going to do the first round of it in a couple weeks here, and I'm really excited about it. We're going to touch on what I'm about to kind of skip over really quickly right now. We're going to do it in really, really great depth and cover anything you've ever wanted to understand about LUTs you're going to have by the end of that course. So be sure to check that out. Back to my task here. Let me drop this ACES transform on here, and let's just say we want to make a really simple Alexa to Rec 709 LUT using an ACES pipeline, and I want to make this into a LUT. Now, on its face, what I could do if I wanted to create a LUT from here is right-click on my thumbnail, go to Generate LUT, 33-point cube, and I'm going to go to my desktop, and I'm just going to save this right to my LUT folder, and we'll call this something sensible like this. I'm going to hit save. I'm going to go over to my LUTs, and I'm going to refresh. And now, instead of applying this Alexa transform, let's look at the application of this LUT. And we will look at it on a ramp so that we can see an example of what Jim just talked about, of broken curves. So let's turn this off, and I'm going to flip a setting or check a setting in here. Okay, good. That's where it belongs. And let me turn my ramp back on because I want to see, you know, that I guess another answer to Jim's question would be that, like, I do pretty often evaluate curves against a grayscale ramp. So I guess that is really a luma curve. So maybe I wasn't entirely answering correctly before when I said I don't analyze curves on a basis solely of luminance. But if we look at what I've just cooked down out of Resolve off of this ACES transform, in theory, that should give me a very, very close match. Even though it's not the identical mechanism, that should give me a very, very close match to the curve that I just drew inside of my ACES transform. And if we just look at that through the ramp, that's what that looks like. And let's explode it out nice and large so that it's easy for us to see. It's a nice smooth line, and the only non-smooth things, the only bit of jaggedness that you're seeing is due to the resolution of my waveform scope. It's not at all to do with the resolution or to do with the smoothness of this curve. And we can even grab a still of this if we want so that we can audition the two against one another. And let's now turn that transform off so that we have a linear curve. And let's take the LUT we just built and apply it. So you guys can see here, I've got, it's a little tricky to spot, but I've actually got these little sort of like hammocks happening at regular intervals here on my curve. Can you guys see what I mean here? If I contrast this with that, it's a slightly fatter signal, and it's tough to tell at this resolution. The clearest one is right here in the very toe of the image. I've got this little hammock kind of swinging down underneath the line that I would expect my curve to travel on if it's supposed to be a dead match to this implementation of the curve here inside of ACES. So when we talk about the breaking of curves, one of the ways that curves can break is when we are working with LUTs and we have the interpolation of a LUT, which only has a fixed number of sample points from 0 to 1. The way that the LUT parsing algorithm, to use a fancy term, basically how Resolve or whatever application is using the LUT and deciding, all right, how do I interpolate the pixels in between the sample points that I have? Depending on the algorithm that we're using, which right now is trilinear and one of the more simple ones, you can end up with some bad guesses, is essentially what it comes down to. And those bad guesses will lead to kind of sharp, non-smooth, sort of toothy or like hammocky looking things in our curve that to me constitute a broken curve. It's a fairly subtle example if we compare it to something like, you know, like another broken curve would be, you know, like the custom curves actually kind of intentionally make it a little tough on us to do this. But if I say, let's get some editable splines up in here, and I like choke my spline way in on both sides, I could get a broken curve in that way as well. And you can see it here in my image. I've got like some kind of hard edges there. Again, maybe not the most extreme example, but those would be examples of what I would think of when I think of broken curves that are maybe, depending on the image, not going to do the nicest thing to the image. The tricky part is there's going to be some images where you may not even notice, but there will be others where if you have a jagged or a broken or a non-smooth curve, you're going to affect it at weird places where those edges lie. So those to me would be broken curves, and I will revise my first answer. I often will evaluate a process that I'm contemplating dropping into my chain, whether it's creative or technical, on a waveform ramp and evaluate, okay, is it nice and beautiful and smooth like I have with this built-in ACES transform, or is it got a bit more kind of jagged, toothy character like I'm seeing here? And by the way, just to kind of round out this tangent about LUTs and the fact that they can be jagged in nature when we apply them, I can actually fix this. If I go to my project settings and I set my 3D lookup table interpolation instead of trilinear to tetrahedral, and let's just pay attention right down here to this little most extreme hammock and what happens to it when I hit save. Cleans itself up. So we can apply LUTs in better or worse ways in terms of getting sharp or smooth edges, but that would be, those are a couple examples of like harder edges that I try to avoid and will usually audition and look for by putting a transform up on top of a grayscale ramp.
Just to stay on LUTs for a second, Rami Aiki is asking about the difference between using the 65 LUT instead of the 33-point LUT, or when you're creating one.
Yeah, really good question. And again, where I'm excited to be able to offer you guys the deep dive on this subject when we get into the show LUT course. But in short, if we just think about it this way, look, LUTs, as many of us know, is lookup table, right? And it's lookup table in the same way that like your multiplication tables in arithmetic or in elementary school were lookup tables. You had a vertical row of input values and a horizontal row and a vertical row. And you had fixed sample points for like, okay, 2 times 3 is 6, 3 times 3 is 9, 4 times 3 is 12, so on and so forth. But what that multiplication table didn't tell you is what 2.5 times 3 is. There is no column for that unless you guys had really different multiplication tables that I didn't have in elementary school. We have to guess at those values. So the application of a LUT is all about guessing at those values in between. And the fancy term for that is interpolation. It's about making a mathematical exercise of what you and I might do if we were faced with that. Even if you were to ask 7-year-old Cullen in elementary school and say, okay, Cullen, we know what 2 times 3 is if we look at the multiplication table up there. And we know what 3 times 3 is if we look at the multiplication table up there. Can you figure out what 2.5 times 3 is? I'd like to think that given enough opportunity and enough time, I might have been able to reason myself to a decent solution and say, well, I know that if 2 times 3 is 6 and 3 times 3 is 9, maybe 2.5 times 3 would be somewhere in between those two numbers. And I could at least get that far and reason it out. Interpolation is just a very, very rigid mathematical exercise of that nature, where we're trying to make a best guess about, okay, what does it mean for the values in between the table that was set up for us in the lookup table? So to answer the original question, the more sample points we have, the less guesses we have to make, right? We know that in a 10-bit signal, we have 1,024 potential sample points in each channel. So theoretically, we could have a LUT for every single sample point. We could have a LUT that was 1,024 by 1,024 by 1,024 sample points in size. There would be some challenges with that, namely that the processing power used to apply that LUT would be really, really high. And the size of the LUT itself would be huge because we would have to be storing values for every single pixel value in the image. So that's kind of the trade-off of like the size of a LUT versus the precision of it. And what we'll find in keeping with our overall conversation about curves and nonlinearities is there are sweet spots and dead spots within there. Like for example, the difference between a 33 and a 65-point LUT, it's not that great. I mean, it's significant, and in the case of like a final LUT that you would be using for a finish, you'd probably want to use the 65-point LUT, but it may not be as large as it seems. And if you contrast that between the difference of a 17-point LUT and a 33-point LUT, that's a much larger difference because the way that these things scale out in a nonlinear way. So it's fundamentally about how many sample points along the journey from 0 red to 100% red, 0 red to 100%, or 0 green to 100% green, and same with blue. How many sample points along that journey have we plotted out within the LUT? The more of those sample points we have, the less guessing our software has to do on our behalf.
Tao wants to know about creating good skin tones in a creative look. Are curves a good tool to do that? How does that fit in?
Yeah, really good question. Curves are a great tool for that. Curves, I would say, are the tool for that. Because if we think about what we're trying to do, I mean, this is the perfect use case for our curves conversation. Let's get a color space transform going on here again. And let's look at, where's my good old Isabella? We haven't hung out with her yet today. Oh, you guys will have to hang with me while I turn off my Fusion composition. And let's look at good old Isabella here. So if we look at this image and we say, okay, we want to do something with our skin tone. We want to do task or tasks plural X with our skin tone in this image. We want to, and that really could be confined to, or we could think of it in terms of like, all right, do we want to change the amount of red, green, or blue in there? Do we want to change the hue, saturation, or luminance using those kind of three new forms of specifying color and color difference that we just talked about at the beginning of grade school today? But that's all we're trying to do, is we're trying to affect a change. But what we want to do is we want to affect it in the broadest way possible, and we want to affect it in such a way that right at its edge, at the edge between like her skin tone and her lips, for example, it's a nice, smooth, gradual takeoff so that we're not creating chatter or artifacts at the edge of where the hue selection that we've made begins and where it ends, and the adjustment being applied to one side but not the other of that edge. That's like my big beef with qualifiers, as you guys know, is even in their softest form, it's very, very easy to inadvertently create weirdness at the edge of the qualification that you've made. Whereas with a curve, you can do things a lot more broadly. So in the case of like, let's just do kind of I'm going to go a little crazy with Isabella's skin tone here, more so than I might actually out in the wild, just for the sake of argument. So let's look at a vector scope here. And let's say we want to start off by getting just a little kind of ruddier with our skin tone. We actually want to make things a hair more red than they're coming in. So the way I might do that using curves is I could sample a nice broad region of skin here, like so that I've got my goalpost and then I've got a middle point in between. And I could move my hue versus hue just a little bit up so that I'm getting slightly redder skin than I had before. And hopefully you guys can see that flipping on and off. Like, okay, that's kind of nice. And then let's say I also, my obsession with this narrow section of my overall image, my overall like range of hues and values, my obsession with skin is persisting. I still want to do more just to this little subset of my image. The next thing I might do is go to my hue versus sat, and I could do the same kind of thing. Sample a nice broad region, and maybe I want to pump up the sat. Maybe I want to make her skin pop even further. And just for a second, let's go really nuts. And I want you guys to see that it is still possible to get like noise and chatter at the extreme ends of things. Like you guys can see how like exactly what I just talked about before. We're like, okay, this got swept inside of this shape, but this little section of her lip of her upper lip, for whatever reason, wasn't quite red enough to fit inside of my goalposts. Okay. So what I can do there with my curves, is I could grab this goalpost and gently move it outwards, like so. And in fact, as long as I'm not starting to affect neighboring hues in an undesired way, I could go considerably far on both sides of my goalposts in an attempt to kind of roll in more of the input hues to the operation. And again, this is like way more of an extreme example than I would ever make, but like that's kind of a textbook case of the trouble that we encounter anytime we're trying to manipulate any sub portion of our overall image pixels in a discrete way. The harder we push it, the harder it is to get it clean, and the harder or more precisely we slice into the image and say this is in and that's out, the easier it is to get artifacting. So curves are our best shot at doing that nice and smoothly with a gradual takeoff between something happening and nothing happening. So if I back this back now way down to a more sensible place, I've now rotated some hue, I've added some saturation, and let's even go one further. Let's do a hue versus loom and say, in addition to making my subject's skin a little bit redder and making my subject's skin a little bit more colorful overall, I actually want to change the density of her skin. I want to make it a little bit darker in terms of its luminance. I can do that once again with another one of these versus curves by eyedroppering a nice broad region and grabbing that same set of portion of my goalposts and dragging things down. And this is going to have a slow response on purpose because this is probably the easiest of the three versus curves that I've just used to get artifacting and edge problems with. So it's going to have a slow response. But you guys can see in net, I'm making, whether or not it's aesthetically pleasing or exactly what I would want to do, I'm making a very, very like significant change to the skin of my subject. And yeah, it's affecting some of my reds and other areas, but it's really, really soft. And I would challenge you to take even, like this is probably more extreme on all three of these adjustments that I just made than anything I would probably do out there in the wild. And it certainly aesthetically is not something that I would be pumped to be applying to my image. But what I can say about this, unlike trying to get this same level of modification with a qualifier, this is never going to break. Like I can put this on any image that I want to, and it's always going to be smooth. Like it may not be exactly what I want to do. And I might even need to like choke it in and like, add a power window to confine the operation to a particular spatial region, but it's never going to break. I'm never going to get those nasty chattering edges that we've all seen with a qualifier that we drew too hastily. So I think like things like skin tones and really memory colors in general, those are one of the ideal places where we can apply curves in this very soft and gentle way and still affect like significant, like meaningful change on our image without compromising on its integrity.
Similar question from Tao. Is white balance something that can be done with curves, and is that the tool that makes sense to do that with?
Yeah, really good question. So there is a sort of complex image sciencey like explanation of that, but the short answer is yes, absolutely. And in fact, when we make a color or a color temperature adjustment on an image here in Resolve, like using our color temperature, which as we hopefully all know now is color space aware. It is like photometric in nature, meaning that it's pretty similar to what we would get. If I cool things off by 1,000 degrees here, that's roughly what I would get, or more than roughly, pretty darn close to what I would get if I were to set my sensitivity in camera to 4,600 Kelvin instead of 5,600 Kelvin. So it is photometrically accurate, and it's using the same basic mechanism in both cases, which is the application of what image scientists call a chromatic adaptation transform. A chromatic adaptation transform, beyond being intimidating sounding in its name and a little bit complex in terms of the type of curves used, a chromatic adaptation transform is curves. That's what it's doing underneath the hood. It's simply curves that are driven by mathematical models, as opposed to some guy who decided, hey, for most of the images, I feel like this on, like whatever, like this on my red plus this on my green plus that on my blue ends up netting out to about 2,000 degrees of warming. Like it's not some average that's been derived from a bunch of trial and error on practice images. It's a mathematical model that has been derived using like measured data of the way our eyes work. So complicated answer to a simple question, which is yes, absolutely. Under the hood, things like color temperature adjustment, they're all driven by curves.
Resolve has a lot of different types of curves. What do they do, and how do you know when to use each one?
Yeah, so we've ended up touching on some of them here in our a question or so back, but let's just kind of round out our conversation about the curves inside of Resolve. So we've looked at our custom curves. They are the one set of curves in my set of curves options here, which don't have a versus convention to them. But if it helps to simplify and unify our thinking about curves, we can actually state the function of these custom curves in terms of a versus dynamic. We can say that these custom curves are our luminance versus luminance curves, meaning that we are taking input luminance and mapping output luminance. So if I take my input luminance of 0 and move it up to, whatever this is, maybe a 0.2, that's a remapping of my input luminance to my output luminance. So it's a lum versus lum curve. And I'm going to turn off these editable splines that I enabled a minute ago. And if we keep going through here, all of these X versus Y curves that constitute the remainder of our curves section are all, each of those terms is designating the X and the Y axis. So The x-axis of hue versus hue is hue, and the y-axis of hue versus hue is hue, meaning that I am going to, along the x-axis, specify a range of hues which I wish to affect in some way, which I wish to alter. And then on the y-axis, I'm going to move that range up or down, and in doing so, rotate its hue. And in the case of what I'm doing right now, get a really, really exceptionally lovely image. But you guys can see my point there. That's what that versus convention is all about there. Is we've got, it's always going to be, first term is going to describe the horizontal or the x-axis, and the second term is always going to describe the vertical or the y-axis. So in the case of hue versus hue, we are selecting an input hue along the x-axis, and we are modifying its output hue by manipulating the y-axis or the vertical axis. And if we take that same logic and apply it to hue versus sat, we are selecting an input hue along the vertical, or excuse me, we are selecting our input hue along the horizontal or x-axis, like so. And now when I move my control point up or down, instead of rotating its hue, I am either increasing or decreasing the saturation of the pixels which fall within these goalposts that I've defined along the x-axis. So that's our hue versus sat. Hue versus loom, same kind of thing. X-axis continues to be hue. I'm selecting a range of hues, except now instead of wishing to alter the hue of those hues or the saturation of those hues, I wish to alter the luminance of those hues, which we looked at a moment ago. So if I've got this kind of greeny yellow band that I've selected here and I drop it downward, I'm going to see those pixels begin to darken. And as I said a moment ago, this is the least responsive of the curves, and that's by design because this is a very easy way to flip your image upside down and make it look weird. So that's why they have implemented this sort of like very slow response when we move our curves. Like I've dropped my gain all the way to 0 in this case, and it's not affecting like a night and day difference there, but that's really what Resolve have determined. This goes back to our conversation about control versus constraint. That's a sensible constraint that the engineers behind Resolve have put into place so that we are not making completely nonsensical, destructive hue versus loom curves in our image. And let's round things out by looking at our loom versus sat. And we can, these are all going to be, like sat curves for the remainder here. So loom versus sat, we're flipping the script a little bit. Now we've got to really apply that idea that we just learned, that x-axis is an input parameter and y-axis is an output parameter. So in this case, we've got our luminance, and we can get a little visual cue because we see as we move from left to right, we're going pure black to pure white. So in this case, I'm selecting a particular range of luminance, and at that range, I am affecting its saturation. So the most common application of this curves tool that I would use would be to take this upper end here and say, hey, at the upper end of my luminance curve, my brightest colors, I really want to tame in their saturations like so. So this is a non-linear way of manipulating the saturation of my image. Instead of saying I want to pull all saturation out in equal measure or push saturation into all pixels, I'm saying here, as my image gets brighter and brighter, I want to further and further limit its saturation. If we go on to our sat versus sat, this is sort of the evil twin of our loom versus loom. It's the same kind of thing. You can think of it as the same kind of deal where we're saying, hey, we're taking input saturations and mapping their output saturations. So this can be a good way of creating what we might think of as saturation roll-off, in the same way that, like with our custom curves, if I do this, again, without these dopey editable splines, if I do something like this, this is what we would typically think of as a roll-off, where I'm adding contrast in the high end, but I'm doing it in a way that is going to allow me to preserve tonal detail and prevent it from clipping for as long as possible. Same thing here with our sat curves. We can create saturation roll-off by dropping things down and maybe even adding a shoulder here, so that as the saturation increases, we are gradually imposing more and more pressure on it so that it's really never being given a chance to reach that far outer edge of the container. And you guys have heard me talk about in prior episodes of grade school that this is the fundamental mechanism of the color boost knob, is it's doing a non-linear sort of rolling saturation adjustment, saturation roll-off adjustment when we turn that knob positively, we're increasing saturation, but doing it more to the lower than the higher saturations. And when we pull it backwards, we are decreasing saturations more aggressively on the higher saturations and less so on the lower saturations. And for the last one, since we can round out our tour of the curves here in Resolve, Sat versus Lume, this is a new one in Resolve 17. And this is, again, we can look at our x-axis being saturation and our y-axis being luminance. And in this case, we are saying that the higher our saturation, the more, like if I were to do an operation like this, the higher our sat, the more we want to drop its luminance. So it's a way of kind of globally increasing, for example, the density of the most saturated colors in the frame, which is what I'm doing here. We could, of course, do the exact opposite. And I would say, I want the least saturated colors to be the most dense in my image. And you can see here that if I get aggressive enough with this, I can break it and do preposterous things. So this is an example of an area where we need to kind of impose our own constraint because the tool has been set up in such a way that it can lead to really zany results if improperly applied. And there's also the fact that like the effective range of this tool, again, this goes back to the conversation about constraint. The effective range of this tool is perhaps not ideal for when we're working in a log space. This range is really more set up to be used with an image that's already been normalized into like a gamma rec 7 or 9 type of space. So when we have it here in our log container, even though I have this full canvas to work with, you can see from my histogram here, my whole image, which has a very healthy dynamic range of, like deepish shadows, like some kind of shadow, but also plenty of high end. The whole image is living here, like in the very left quarter or fifth of it. So that's going to, unless I'm aware of that as the operator, that's going to alter my ability to use the tool effectively. So that's another example of an area where you might improve upon the design of this tool by imposing a more sensible constraint. But that's another tangent, connects back up to what we were talking about earlier when we initially talked about the custom curves and what I love less about them. And that's plenty of curved stuff, I think, for one day. If there's any other burning quick ones out there, Good Ollie, we could do one more. Otherwise, I think that's a good place to stop.
Yeah, I've got one more bonus question from Rafa. He says, could we get some insight on the soft clip part of the YRGB curve? For example, if I drop down my exposure for artistic purposes, then I use this option to recover detail, would it flatten the image?
It might. I'll share with you the soft clip. I like the idea of it very much, but the problem is these numbers don't mean anything to me. And again, one of my themes that I touched on in the Learn with Masters event this last weekend is that, of course, we want to be looking at images and evaluating all of our work in terms of what it does to images, but that's not enough. Like, I want to get a sense of what's the overall character of the operation of the manipulation that I'm making and how is it going to affect 20 images, not just one. And in order to do that, I need some sort of objective feedback like I would get with my curves graph. So with the soft clip, I think the challenge there that we have to overcome is you're generally going to want to have like a grayscale ramp ready, like so, which you don't have to have a DCTL. You can just use a generator on your edit page if you didn't have this. But I would generally want to have the grayscale ramp handy along with a waveform and probably turn this off for the time being so I can get a concentrated look at what I'm doing with my custom curves, so that in addition to like, I don't need the waveform ramp to look at what I'm doing here in the graph, because as you can see, the graph itself perfectly mirrors what my waveform does. However, when I start playing with my low and soft clip, I'm not going to get any feedback here on that. I'm only going to see it in my waveform. So to answer the original question, yeah, it can absolutely flatten the image. It doesn't have to, and it can be a great creative tool. But to me, the only way to effectively wield it is, in addition to evaluating what it's doing on whatever particular image you happen to be parked on, especially if you're using it in the context of like a global look dev, you really are going to want to have a ramp handy like this so that you can see that aspect of the curve that you are effectively drawing, which is not going to be represented here in the graph itself. So great one to round it out. I hope I've given you guys a bunch more to think about in terms of curves. And I think we should all walk away from this conversation asking, you know, like the next time you go to grade something and the next knob that you reach for, go like, is this a curves driven manipulation that I'm making, or is it something else? And if it's not, could it be? Would there be any advantage to that? I wonder what that would look like, just to start to get curious about what it looks like to apply different types of operations with different types of curves and get a feel for how that can be beneficial to our image in terms of the softness and the portability of these things, and ensuring that we never break or degrade our image in any sort of way. So hope this has been an interesting conversation for you guys. And yeah, we will see you for the next video and for the next episode of Grade School. Thank you all very much. Have a great Friday.